morning. First of all, I want to say thank you to everyone who helped out with the front lawn giveaway yesterday. Yesterday we didn't have as many people show up from the community as we sometimes do, but we do this as one way to reach out into our community and to show love and to help people and to serve, right? And we have a lot of fun while we do it. Sorry, I just had to embarrass Eva for a second there. I bring this up because it connects very well with what we're going to talk about today. First, I have a bit of a confession, though. I personally know, and I've talked about this a fair bit, that as a follower of Christ, I am called to share the good news of Jesus, to share the story that we've been talking about. And I hope we've all noticed it is an amazing story, and it is the best news. But here's the confession. I have to admit that sometimes I don't really know where to start. There are so many views in this world today. How can I possibly engage with each person meaningfully? What is the approach to take? Do I debate about religion? Do I simply just share the gospel? Do I engage in apologetics? Do I use evangelistic strategies? Sometimes it feels like there is so much to know. And I can't know it all, so what do I pick? We have these evangelistic seminars every now and then, and sometimes I've talked about this with Dawn and others. We get people coming from deep south in the States, and they share strategies that work down there, but then we find they don't work here. So, what approaches do we take? And there's so much to know. I've encountered people from different religions, from Islam, Sikhism, Buddhism. I've encountered atheists, agnostics, and even recently people involved in this so-called new spirituality. How do I engage with all of them meaningfully? Have you ever maybe felt that way? Have you ever felt confused, overwhelmed, or maybe even scared when it comes to trying to share the gospel? I think if we're all being honest, at some point we felt something along those lines. Have the hundreds of different approaches that you hear about in different conferences and sermons and things, and you're going to hear about more today, have they ever, been overwhelming? Have you ever, like me, wondered which one's best, which one's easiest? All right, which books do I have to read now? Maybe on top of that, you've noticed that our culture has become increasingly hostile to Christianity and wonder how you can engage with that, or if it's even worth trying. Things have been changing constantly. There was a time, mostly before I was even born, but there was a time when we were invited to share our faith in a mostly positive and receptive environment. And then we watched it transition. When I was a kid, Christians had the benefit of being welcomed to share their faith in a relatively neutral space, where people didn't have an opinion much one way or the other, and they were willing to listen. But now, we aren't usually even invited to share, and when we are, it's usually to a rather hostile audience. What do we do? Now, as usual, I think that we can find the best answers to these problems in Scripture. And so this week we're actually in chapter 29 of the story, which really focuses a lot on Paul's missionary journey, particularly to the Gentiles. Now, contained within chapter 29 is Acts 17, 16 to 34, where we're going to be today. The story of Paul's encounter in Athens. And it is one of my favorite stories in the book of Acts. I think, and I hope most people would agree with me, I think Paul was the greatest missionary that ever lived, and second to Jesus, probably the best evangelist that ever lived. So who better to learn from? And I think Athens is just such a rich story full of surprises and great lessons to learn. So we're going to start in Acts 17, verses 16 to 18. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was greatly upset because he saw that the city was full of idols. So he was addressing the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles in the synagogue and in the marketplace every day who happened to be there. Also, some Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him, and some were asking, "What does this foolish babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods." They said this because he was proclaiming the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So, we have Paul. He's walking along in this big, beautiful city full of architectural wonders. Like this would be today a tourist location. In fact, it might still be. But Paul is deeply troubled. He is not enjoying the beauty here. He is troubled because everywhere he looks, he sees idols. And so Paul decides he's going to do something about this. He begins to go to the synagogue and the marketplace, and he starts to address any Jewish people and Gentiles who follow God that he can find. And talking about, idols are not okay. And we follow Jesus. Jesus is the way. Jesus is the answer, not idols. And while Paul is addressing the people, some philosophers from Athens start to take notice, particularly from two different schools of thought, the Epicureans and the Stoics. So, we don't typically talk about these schools of thought very often today, but for those who aren't familiar, Epicureanism began with this man named Epicurus. Go figure. And he was around in 341 to 270 BC. He argued that the world was made of atoms and that it was purely material. And he claimed that the only valid knowledge was what could be learned through the senses, and that pleasure was life's greatest goal. The purpose of life was to experience tranquility through maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. Now, they weren't completely hedonistic, because Epicurus did make it clear that his philosophy was not primarily concerned with sensual pleasures, but with the mental pleasures of sober reasoning and determining the best course of action in any situation. He also wanted to free people from the idea of the gods, the afterlife, and the fear of death. Epicureans at the time, they saw organized religion as evil, especially the idea that gods will punish evildoers in the afterlife. They didn't deny the existence of the gods, they just maintained that the gods were in some far-off place and completely indifferent to humanity, and when you died, that was it. There is no afterlife. And we're going to see Paul addressing this as we move forward. Sadly, some Epicureanism does seem to have snuck into Christianity today. Have you ever noticed that some people seem to think of God as really far off, rather than very close, and sort of disengaged and not actually caring all that much? Like our prayers don't really matter. They might not even reach him. And that's tragic. And as we're going to see from Paul's engagement with these people, that is not remotely true. Now, another group that he is going to confront, who have taken notice of him, are the Stoics. Now, that was a pantheistic system of thought that prioritized logic. It began in about 334 BC. And what that really means is they believed that the universe was empowered and governed by this, not by gods, but by this impersonal reasoning force that was in everything and connected everything with the divine and the material all together. Basically, God is the universe and he is in everyone and everything. And this is kind of fascinating, but they called this force Logos, or God of the world. Now, you may have noticed that this term comes up in the Gospel of John. Paul seems to redefine that term in light of Christ to show that the true Logos, the true governing force, is not some impersonal guiding thing. Christ as Logos is supremely personal, and he is a divine answer to the problem of sin and death. And this identification by John of a divine person seems to serve to correct the very popular Stoic concept of Logos. And Paul is going to sort of continue in this stream of thought about Jesus as the guiding force, a personal guiding force, not some impersonal, sentient universe. Now, the Stoics also believed the only thing people could truly understand was the physical world. They did not believe in a bodily resurrection, but they did believe that your spirit would continue after death. It was more a matter of uniting with the divine universe and disengaging from the bad material world. And so these philosophers, with this school of thought, they seem to be really confused by what Paul is saying when he talks about Jesus and the resurrection. He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods. Imagine Paul preaching about these things to a group who has absolutely no concept or belief of a resurrection of any kind, and probably don't really know who Jesus is. They're standing there, they hear Paul talking about Jesus and anastasis, which is the Greek word for resurrection. They're probably hearing this as Jesus as some new god and anastasis as some new goddess, right? Because to them, resurrection is not a thing. They're probably hearing this as a name, and he's talking about these foreign things. What is he talking about? And because of this, Paul is taken before something called the Areopagus. So we read about that in Acts 17, 19 to 21. They took Paul and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are proclaiming? For you are bringing some surprising things to our ears. So we want to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there used to spend their time in nothing else than telling or listening to something new. Areopagus. People often think that this Areopagus was some sort of philosophical debating society or something. And while we will see some debate taking place, that is not actually what it was. Historically, the Areopagus was a law court. It was the highest court in Athens. According to local legend that they followed, it was founded by Apollo and their local goddess Athene. And it was made up of the leading citizens of Athens, and it dealt with ethical, cultural, and religious matters, including the supervision of education and the controlling of many visiting philosophers and lecturers. It was initially set up to try the most serious cases, including capital ones like murder. The most famous trial is one that we probably learned about maybe in high school history. That was the trial of Socrates in 399 BC. This philosopher who was charged with impiety and corrupting the young. The chief evidence, and pay attention to this, it's interesting, the chief evidence offered against him was that he didn't acknowledge the city's official gods and that he was introducing new divinities or foreign gods. He was sentenced to death and given hemlock to drink, poison. Paul is accused of the same things. Paul is actually being put on trial here. They took Paul, that phrase translated from the word epilabano. It literally means to take hold of or seize, and is often used of arresting someone. Paul may have gone willingly, but the truth is he wasn't actually being offered a choice. And while there is definitely very likely some curiosity involved from the people on this council, as Luke seems to suggest, it really does seem kind of like Luke is downplaying the seriousness of the after the fact. Kind of like how people will downplay the seriousness of an event after it happens. For example, you see someone, they take a really big fall, and then they get up, and witnesses are really worried about how they are because it looked so serious. It was such a bad fall. And the person, while still in pain, will say, "Oh, I'm fine. It was no big deal." Meanwhile, there was a moment where they were lying on the ground wondering what they had broken. It kind of seems like that. The evidence is that Paul has been taken by force to the local authorities, to the law court. And Luke is sort of, after the fact, downplaying, like, it was going to be okay. And as you'll see, it is okay in the end. But it had the potential to go a very different way. Maybe the way it did for Socrates. Anyway, as Paul is standing before this law court, we see his defense begin. Acts 17:22-23. So Paul stood before the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that you are very religious in all respects. For as I went around and observed closely your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Therefore, what you worship without knowing, this I proclaim to you." What is Paul really doing here? On one hand, Paul is beginning by referring to the local culture and starting with the altar of an unknown God, and he even quotes one of their famous Greek poets named Aratus. But on the other hand, he is also going to be face-on confronting the local culture. We have to remember that Paul is not here primarily to make a philosophical argument for a new type of God. His speech is answer to the charge of bringing foreign gods. His underlying point, as we're going to see here, is actually that, I can't be bringing any foreign gods because the God I'm proclaiming is already being worshipped here in Athens, even if it is in ignorance. He couldn't be a foreign god since he already has a shrine here. And once the people will realize who he is, they're going to realize he is the creator and the judge of all, and not just some foreign god. He is the God who already claims the whole world and is unknowingly being worshipped here in Athens. By having an altar here to the unknown God, they are already implicitly acknowledging that they need to know who he is. And so Paul goes on to critique the idols and forward the worship of the true God. In Acts 17:24-25, and then jumping ahead to 29, we read, "The God who made the world and everything in it, who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives life and breath and everything to everyone." And then jumping a little farther ahead, "So since we are God's offspring, we should not think the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human skill and imagination." In Athens, so many gods had their own shrines. They were everywhere. This included mainstream ones like Zeus and Poseidon, but it also included local ones like Athene. And her temple, called the Parthenon, was actually one of the architectural wonders of the world, and parts of it still stand today on what's called the Acropolis. Standing in view of those temples, those architectural wonders, Paul says, your whole system is nonsense. Your stunning architecture is a mistake. I am not introducing foreign gods. You are worshiping non-existent gods. And since human beings are in some sense the true God's offspring, which is what your poet Aratus said, it makes no sense to represent him with things that are made by human hands. The idols that you worship, just like the shrines they're in, are all nonsense. And in 1 Thessalonians 1:9, while talking about this sort of situation, Paul insisted that when someone became a follower of Christ, they turned from idols to serve a living and true God. His point to them is, these idols that you worship, they are just a comedy, a parody of the truth. Yes, the sun is powerful and important. Yes, the sea is powerful and important. Erotic impulse is powerful and important. However, Zeus, Poseidon, Aphrodite, they don't exist. They are just parodies of the good provision of God the Creator. And he goes on in verses 25 to 28, not only to critique idolatry, but to outflank the philosopher's way of thinking. He says, "Nor is he served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives life and breath and everything to everyone." And then continuing, he says, "From one man he made every nation of the human race to inhabit the entire earth, determining their set times and the fixed limits of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope around for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move about and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. That's the quote from Aratus that I mentioned. And so Paul right now is addressing the schools of thought of the Stoicism, the Epicureans, and even the followers of Plato. He is now saying, you guys are all wrong. As mentioned, the Stoics replaced this big pantheon of gods with one sort of divine force in everything and everyone. Now, there's one problem with this sort of pantheism, although there's actually many, but there's one big one, and that is that it really can't offer any sort of critique of evil. Because if this one entity of Stoicism is in everyone and everything, then the perception of good and bad are just a trick of the light. There's no such thing. But we can all see that there really is. And so the Stoics said, you just have to accept things the way they are and grit your teeth and just learn to be calm through it all. But Paul here says, no. Yes, God is in fact all around us and very close. But he is different from us, and he approaches us in love, wanting a relationship. And he does know that things are in fact messed up. There is good and evil, and he is one day going to fix that. And then, in answer to the Epicureans, who, as we said, believed that gods existed, but are a long way away, and don't intervene down here, they maintain that the world developed all on its own, teaching the original sort of evolutionary doctrine that was adopted in the 18th century. And they taught that there was no point praying because they didn't hear, they didn't answer. When you died, there's nothing left. And it became very popular. It was sort of the default of many Gentiles because it denied the old belief that there were angry gods waiting to torture you. And that appealed to them. And Paul's response to this school of thought is to speak about a creator God who was actively involved in our creation, who lovingly created everything, and who is in fact very close to us and not far off. And that he wants to dwell with us and have relationship with us. In verse 27, he says, you think the gods are far off, but this true God who lovingly created us is not far off from each of us. And then he continues to sort of address the Plato's school of thought, which said, the riddles of the world can't be answered. We are ignorant. The best thing to do is keep old religions going because they maintain social order. Paul addresses that way of thinking in verses 30 through 31. He says, therefore, although God has overlooked such times of ignorance, he now commands all people everywhere to repent because he has set a day on which he is going to judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he designated, having provided proof to everyone by raising him from the dead. Paul says, on one hand, you're right. There has been a time of human ignorance, but that is now over. The truth has been revealed to us in this man, Jesus, and he is going to solve it all. And now God is saying, I'm not overlooking your ignorance anymore. you need to repent in light of these newly revealed promises, and I'm going to set everything right. And God is doing this by appointing Jesus to be judge of the living and the dead, raising him from the dead. And tragically, we see at the final verses of Acts 17, this encounter in Athens, that there were many who could not accept what Paul had to say. And the real tripping point was the resurrection of Jesus. It was so foreign to their thinking, the idea of a resurrection. And you know what? Today, that is very often a tripping point for people when we share the gospel. One of the keys is convincing people that the resurrection truly happened. But we do also see that some did listen to Paul, and they did accept what he had to say. Now, I have to continue by saying there is never going to be one guaranteed method that's always going to work in sharing the gospel. You're going to, just like Paul, have times where it works and times where it doesn't. But there are some really good lessons and methods we can learn from Paul's encounter here. Paul finds common ground with his opposition, but he also confronts the lies in their culture and way of thinking. That's key there. And we're going to talk about how a balance is needed. You know, Paul uses their altar to an unknown God as a place to start his defense. And there are still signs to the unknown God all around today. Paul talks about how creation cries out to God's existence. There are certain big themes in life that people across all cultures and time have known are important, but find difficult and confusing. Things like justice, love, freedom, beauty, spirituality, power, and truth. They see that these things exist, but don't have a great answer for why. Thoughtful people everywhere have puzzled over these questions. And we see in the way Paul presents the gospel that the Christian message has the capacity to tell a larger story that actually makes sense of these things that matter to people. Why and how these things went wrong and how they can be put right in Jesus. And there are signposts everywhere pointing to God as the answer. And incidentally, Christians are meant to be some of those signposts in the way we live and speak. And so one application point here is be aware that all people, whether they realize it or not, are wrestling with those big questions. How do I reconcile the existence of these things with reality? And a good strategy is learn to share the story the way Paul did in a few minutes. You know, think of it as your elevator speech. You know, you got a 3-minute elevator ride. How are you going to share the story of Jesus in those 3 minutes that helps people see he explains those big questions they have about love and justice and truth and our existence? But then after finding common ground, Paul goes on to confront the way they think. And you might be surprised to realize that the main ways of thinking, the main schools of thought there, are still the main schools of thought today for many. Modern secularism that is so popular today is just Epicureanism, with some scientific footnotes added and the myth of progress. You know, The idea that the world under its own steam is constantly getting better and better despite all evidence to the contrary. For many, the gods or God are absent, leaving the world to run all on its own, either because they don't care or they don't exist. When you're talking to those people, take the same approach as Paul. Speak of a God who did in fact create everything lovingly. He was involved, and he did it because he is not far off and impersonal, but because he wants a relationship with us. Stress that God is close and that he loves them. You know, the newer forms of paganism that we see popping up today, there are things like idol worship. Idol worship is still everywhere, even if it's not recognized as such. You know, for example, in 2023, there was a new survey that showed more and more Americans than ever view money as the primary force in life. You know, the ancient god of Mammon is still being actively worshipped in society today. People still journey to his altar and make sacrifices all the time of time and family and happiness, all to get more money. Aphrodite, that goddess of erotic love, is still being actively worshipped in society today. The pornography industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And in the lives of many, erotic attraction, or lust as we know it, just supersedes everything. Chastity, marital faithfulness, the lives of unborn children, and the upbringing of children are all regularly sacrificed on her altar. You know, the old Roman god of war and power, Mars, is still worshipped by many today. Brute force and violence, very often allied with money and sex. You know, the thriving arms industry, horrible, evil nations practicing rape as part of military strategy. Idol worship is still a huge religion today. That many just don't see that. And so, when dealing with those people, take Paul's approach once again. Be aware of the fact that everyone is actually worshiping something, even if they think they're an atheist. And show them how much that they are in fact worshiping these gods, and show them how much they are sacrificing in return for absolutely nothing except maybe even more suffering and difficulty. And demonstrate how the worship of the true God is far more fulfilling and rewarding. And demonstrate that by being people of joy and peace. Things that are lacking so much in those who chase after idols. And finally, we still see pantheism popping up today, much like the Stoic way of thinking, in New Age religions and in the new spirituality. It's just Stoicism under a new skin. You know, just last week, I was sitting in a coffee shop talking to a young woman, and I asked her what spiritual beliefs she had, looking for some common ground. And she told me that she believes essentially that the universe is God, that it is in everything and everyone, connecting it all, and that people can pray to it and manifest what they want in reality. You know, as Solomon said, there is nothing new under the sun. And you know what? Sometimes the old strategies of Paul are still the best in addressing these old schools of thought that just keep popping up. Ask those people, can you explain the existence of evil in your way of thinking? They can't. Because if God is in everyone and everything, there is no such thing as good and evil. But there very obviously is. And then explain to them that yes, God, there is a God, and He is in fact all around us. But He is different from us. He is not us. He is greater than us, and He is totally good, and He loves us personally. And there is, in fact, evil, and it is because of our choices to turn away from God. But God has a solution for that. There are so many lessons to be learned from the Bible in how to engage with culture, whatever that culture looks like. Possibly one of the most important lessons to learn from Paul's encounter here is that the good news can take on and recontextualize anything that the pagan world can come up with. Any philosophy of thought that the pagan world can come up with, we can probably find some common ground with it, and we can reshape it to explain how, no, the truth is far better than that. In Paul's speech, we see the possibility that pagan ignorance of the true God can, in fact, provide a starting point for sharing the gospel message. In drawing out the altar to the unknown God. And then in critiquing their culture of idolatry and their schools of thought and showing them how the worldviews just don't work. But it all finds a good answer under Jesus. Christians today will often struggle with Paul's approach. We'll either be so afraid of idolatry that we don't notice the altars to the unknown God, leading against and warning against attempts to see glimpses of God in the sunrise or the smile of a child. And others are so eager to embrace and affirm anything that looks vaguely religious that we often ignore or forget the real problem of idolatry. And some today, tragically, are so eager to engage with contemporary philosophy and culture that they forget how the biblical story actually works and produce a new, philosophically framed version of the faith that has occasional biblical decoration added in. And others are so eager to proclaim the gospel, the biblical story just as they see it, that they ignore the challenge to engage with contemporary culture and ideas. The key here is that we need a prayerful, balanced approach. We look at how Jesus approached people, and we look at Paul's encounters, like in Athens, and we learn from them, but we pray about them, and we seek God-given balance in how we do it. We make sure that we are aware of the biblical story and hold true to it, not compromising it. But we also do our best to be aware of and engage with the current culture, to be relevant and look for ways to contextualize that culture and explain it using the gospel. Say, this is the truth. You might have caught glimpses of it, but it's been distorted. Here's the reality. I want to finish by saying we need to grasp the larger world that the gospel reveals. explore it with delight, and explain it at every opportunity in light of the gospel. And also express it through the works of mercy, beauty, wisdom, justice, and truth, which leave unmistakable fingerprints of Jesus. Little altars to the unknown God, pointing to him. I'm going to have a final quote from a beautiful book called The Challenge of Acts. And then we're going to break up and we're going to pray for, very quickly, just have one person in your group pray, because I went kind of long. And I know I do that sometimes. But after I share this quote, which is just, I think, an interesting illustration, we're going to break up into groups of 3 or 4, pray for just a few seconds, and then we'll go into our final worship. So, quoting N.T. Wright, in William Golding's last novel, The Double Tongue, the heroine is the priestess of Apollo at Delphi. She has been Apollo's slave, inhaling hallucinatory vapors and then answering in hexameters the personal and political questions that people ask, including one from the young Julius Caesar. When she was younger, she had found Apollo to be a violent, frightening reality. But for years now, she has felt the old gods withdrawing, disappearing, leaving behind them a void. But that void, that unknown, has somehow seemed to be full of gentle mystery. In her old age, the rulers of Athens, grateful for her long service at Delphi, write to say they want to put up a statue of her. And she thinks back to this unknown, after the wild pagan gods had disappeared. A sense of something different, inexplicably tender and benign. No, she says, don't put up a statue to me. Please build a simple altar and inscribe it with the words, to the unknown God.